The smell of 10,000 tons of decomposing garbage is not something you get used to. That is a lie told by people who visit for an hour on a school field trip. You do not get used to it. You simply negotiate a truce with your olfactory nerve. You learn to separate the notes of the bouquet. The cloying sweetness of rotting citrus, the sharp ammonia of cat litter, the metallic tang of discarded electronics, and the heavy, wet bedrock of sewage sludge. I sat in the operator's cab of the overhead bridge crane, 60 feet above the tipping floor of the Phoenix Reclamation Facility in Gary, Indiana. Below me, the pit was a chaotic ocean of multicolored refuse, a 30-foot deep concrete canyon filled with the refuse of the Rust Belt. My hands rested lightly on the dual joystick controls, feeling the hum of the electric motors through the plastic grips. This was the heartbeat of the plant. Waste to energy. We took the garbage that nobody wanted, burned it at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and spun a steam turbine to push 25 megawatts into the northern Indiana grid. It was alchemy for the industrial age. We turned filth into light. I nudged the left stick forward. The massive hydraulic grapple, a 5-fingered steel claw the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, descended on steel cables. The winch drum whined, a high-pitched vibration that I felt in my teeth rather than heard. I watched the grapple sink into a mountain of black plastic bags and shattered pallets. With a thumb toggle, I engaged the hydraulics. The tines bit down, crunching through wood and metal with 3,000 psi of crushing force. The load swung up, dripping an unidentified gray slurry. I tracked the carriage sideways, moving the payload toward the feed hopper of Boiler Unit 2. "Vance, you awake up there?" The radio on the console crackled. It was Kowalski, the shift supervisor. I keyed the mic. "Water content is high today, Stan. Too much yard waste. I'm mixing it with the dry commercial stuff to keep the BTU value up. If I feed it wet, the furnace temp drops below 1800 and the EPA sensors will trip." "Just keep the hopper full," Kowalski said, his voice clipped. "We've got 3 haulers backed up at the scale house and the weighmaster is not answering. I'm going down to check it out. Keep the burn hot." "Copy." I dropped the load into the hopper. The steel chute swallowed the trash, feeding it onto the reciprocating grates down in the combustion chamber. I glanced at the monitors lined up above the window. Furnace temperature, 2015 degrees. Steam flow, 180,000 pounds per hour. Oxygen levels, optimal. The physics of the burn were perfect. It was 4:45 a.m. on a Tuesday in late September. Outside the corrugated steel walls of the plant, the sky over Gary would be that bruised purple color that passes for dawn in a steel town. Inside, under the sodium vapor lights, it was always a dusty, hazmat orange. I continued the rhythm. Drop, lift, swing, release. It was hypnotic. A man can lose himself in the mechanics of the crane. You stop thinking about the mortgage, the divorce papers sitting on the kitchen counter in a cold apartment in Hammond, the ache in your lower back. You become part of the hydraulics. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The radio remained silent. Usually the chatter was constant. Drivers complaining about wait times, floor operators calling out jams, the control room monitoring turbine vibration. But the frequency was dead air. I looked down through the reinforced glass of the cab floor. The tipping floor, the massive concrete deck where the trucks backed in to dump their loads into the pit, was empty, save for a pile of cardboard near Bay 4. But the bay doors were open. Through the 60-foot-tall rectangle of Bay 3, I could see the asphalt apron outside. A profound stillness settled over the facility.
The only sound was the constant, chest-rattling roar of the forced draft fans sucking air from the pit to feed the fires. That was part of the design. The building was kept under negative air pressure so the smell would not escape into the neighborhood. We were living inside a vacuum cleaner.
Something moved on the monitor for camera 4, which covered the weighbridge, the entrance to the facility about 200 yards from the main building. I leaned in, squinting at the grainy black and white feed. A waste hauler truck, a Mack Terra Pro, was stopped halfway onto the scale. The driver's door was open. "Stan?" I keyed the mic. "Stan, you at the scale house?" Static. On the screen, a figure walked into the frame. It was Stan Kowalski. I recognized his high-vis yellow vest and the hard hat he never took off. He was walking toward the truck cab. He moved strangely, stiff, jerky, like a marionette with tangled strings. The truck driver stepped out of the cab. Or rather, he fell out. He hit the pavement and did not get up. Stan stopped. He stood over the driver. "Stan, report," I said, my voice echoing in the small cab. On the screen, Stan dropped to his knees. It looked like he was checking the driver for injuries. Then, the driver sat up. The motion was wrong, too fast, too rigid. The driver latched onto Stan's neck. I saw the pixelated spray of dark fluid hit the white paint of the truck door. My brain tried to parse the image. A fight? A medical emergency? Stan thrashed, his arms flailing, but the driver held on with the leverage of a vice. Then two more figures drifted into the frame from the direction of the perimeter fence. They moved with that same shambling, drunken gait. They fell on to Stan. I stood up, knocking my thermos over. Coffee spilled across the floor mat. "Control, this is Crane," I shouted into the radio. "Medical emergency at the scale. Police and EMS. Now!" No answer from the control room. The silence from the pulpit, the central command center, was impossible. They monitored everything. If a rat chewed a wire in the basement, they knew. I looked back at the screen. Stan was not moving anymore. The three figures were crouched over him, their heads bobbing in a rhythmic, tearing motion. I did not panic. Panic is a luxury for people who do not work with high-pressure steam and high-voltage electricity. In this job, panic gets you boiled or electrocuted. Instead, a cold, crystalline focus snapped into place. I needed data. I secured the crane, engaging the parking brakes and killing the main hoist power. I grabbed my hard hat, my leather work gloves, and the heavy-duty flashlight from the charging cradle. I opened the cab door and stepped out onto the catwalk that ran the length of the ceiling. The air up here was thick, hot, and smelled of brimstone. I moved fast, my steel-toed boots ringing against the metal grating. I needed to get to the control room, but to do that, I had to descend 4 flights of stairs to the turbine deck, then cross over to the administration block. I reached the stairwell door. It was heavy, fire-rated steel. I pushed it open, and the roar of the plant changed pitch, shifting from the deep bass of the draft fans to the high-frequency scream of the turbine generator. I descended the stairs, sliding my gloved hand down the railing. Second floor, turbine deck. Through the wire mesh glass of the viewing window, I looked into the turbine hall. The generator was a massive yellow cylinder the size of a locomotive, spinning at 3,600 RPM. It was running smooth, but the control station next to it was empty. Where was the night shift? Miller, Sanchez. I pushed through the door into the hallway leading to the control room. The fluorescent lights flickered. A bad ballast somewhere buzzing like an angry hornet. I reached the control room door. It was locked.
It was never locked. I pounded on the steel. "Miller, open up!" Nothing. I pulled my master key set from my belt. The brass keys jingled, a cheerful sound that felt obscene in the quiet. I found the master for the admin block, slid it into the cylinder, and turned. The tumblers clicked with a tactile precision that felt reassuring. I pushed the door open. The smell hit me instantly. Not garbage. Copper. Iron. And something else, the bowel-loosening stench of raw biological fear. The control room was a bank of monitors and LED readouts. Miller was there. He was sitting in the main chair, slumped forward over the console. The back of his head was a ruin.
The splatter pattern coated the screens in front of him, obscuring the readouts for Boiler 1. Standing over him was Sanchez. Sanchez was a kid, maybe 24. He held a fire extinguisher in his hands, the heavy 20-pound CO2 canister type. He turned to look at me. His eyes were wide, the whites showing all around the irises, but they were glazed, milky, devoid of recognition. His mouth was wet, his jaw hanging slack. "Sanchez," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "Put it down." He made a sound, a wet, guttural rattle deep in his throat, and lunged. He swung the fire extinguisher like a club. I did not think. I reacted. Years of dodging swinging heavy chains and crane loads kicked in. I stepped inside the arc of the swing. The heavy red cylinder missed my head by inches, the air displacement rushing past my ear. I shoved him. He stumbled back, hitting the console. He did not react to the pain. He just rebalanced and came at me again, teeth snapping. I was holding my flashlight, a mag light, 4D cells, aircraft aluminum. As Sanchez lunged, I brought the heavy bezel down in a tight, chopping arc. The impact felt like hitting a side of beef with a hammer. Solid. Wet. The vibration traveled up my arm to the shoulder. Sanchez dropped. He hit the anti-static floor tiles and tried to scramble up immediately. I hit him again. And again. Until he stopped moving. I stood there, chest heaving, the adrenaline dumping into my system like a chemical spill. I looked at the flashlight. The lens was cracked. I looked at the monitors. Camera 1, the gate. The 3 figures were leaving Stan and moving toward the weighbridge office. Camera 2, the perimeter. More figures were emerging from the drainage ditch along the south fence. Camera 3, the tipping floor. A truck had just backed in. The driver was running across the concrete floor, chased by 2 fast-moving figures. They tackled him near the edge of the pit. He went over the edge, screaming. The scream was cut short by the 30-foot drop into the garbage. I forced myself to breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Assess, plan, execute. The plant was compromised. The outside world was compromised. I looked at the control board. The turbine was still spinning. The boilers were still burning. The facility was running on autopilot, but that would not last. If the trash was not fed, the temps would drop. If the temps dropped, the emissions systems would fail. If the steam pressure was not managed, the turbine would trip offline. But first, security. The tipping floor. The tipping floor was a massive open hangar. One side opened to the pit. The other side opened to the world via 7 enormous roll-up doors, each large enough to admit a semi-truck. They were all open. I grabbed the handheld radio from Miller's lifeless desk. I grabbed a set of bolt cutters from the emergency tool locker on the wall. I did not know why, but the weight felt good. I ran out of the control room, back to the stairwell, and down to the ground level. The door to the tipping floor opened, and the noise assaulted me. Even with the fans running, the vast concrete space amplified every sound. The place was huge, a cathedral of industry. Light poured in from the open bays, cutting through the dust motes. I saw movement near Bay 1. 3 intruders, infected, zombies, whatever they were shambling in from the apron. They were drawn to the noise of the fans. I sprinted toward the control panel for the bay doors, located on a structural column between Bay 3 and 4. I slammed my hand against the green button labeled All Close. Nothing happened. I hit it again. Nothing. I looked up at the motors mounted above the door headers. No movement. Damn it, I hissed. The safety interlocks. The system would not close the doors if the optical sensors detected an obstruction. The dust and debris from the chaos probably tripped the eyes, or the collision loops in the floor were detecting the abandoned trucks. I had to close them manually. Each door had a chain hoist override, a heavy steel chain that hung down the side of the track. I ran to door 1. The 3 intruders were 50 feet away. They saw me. They hissed, a sound like a high-pressure line leaking, and broke into a run. I grabbed the chain.
It was greasy, cold steel. I pulled. Ratchet clack, ratchet clack. The gear reduction was steep. You had to pull 10 feet of chain to move the door 1 foot.
Come on, I gritted out, hauling on the chain hand over hand. My triceps burned. The heavy slat door began to descend, rattling in its tracks. The intruders were closing the distance. 40 feet. 30. The door was halfway down. I abandoned door 1. It was low enough that they'd have to crawl. I ran to door 2. Empty. I grabbed the chain and pulled like a madman. The adrenaline gave me strength I did not know I had. The door slammed down, hitting the concrete. I wrapped the chain around the cleat on the wall to lock it. Door 3. There was a truck parked halfway in. I could not close it. I looked at the truck. It was a municipal compactor. Engine idling. I climbed up into the cab. The seat was warm. The air smelled of stale coffee and diesel. I released the parking brake, threw the transmission into reverse, and stomped the gas. The truck lurched backward. I watched the mirrors. As soon as the nose cleared the door track, I slammed the brakes, threw it in park, and bailed out. I grabbed the chain for door 3. A shape tackled me from the side. I hit the concrete hard, the breath driven from my lungs. The smell of rot and dried blood filled my nose. A woman, wearing the torn uniform of a scale house attendant, was on top of me.
Her fingers clawed at my face, her nails digging into my cheek, her teeth snapped inches from my throat.
I got a forearm under her chin, pushing her head back. She was impossibly strong. Her muscles were rigid, spasming with viral energy. I could not reach the bolt cutters I'd dropped. I brought my knee up, driving it into her midsection. It was like kicking a bag of wet sand. She did not even flinch. She bore down, her weight pressing my arm against my own throat. I was choking. My right hand scrabbled across the concrete floor. My fingers brushed something metal. A piece of scrap rebar, maybe 2 feet long, dropped from a load earlier. I gripped the rough, rusted metal. I swung it in a short, desperate arc, driving the end of the rebar into the side of her head. There was a sickening crunch, a sensation of bone giving way under pressure. She went limp instantly, collapsing onto me like a puppet with cut strings. I shoved her dead weight off me and scrambled backward, gasping for air. I wiped my face. My glove came away smeared with black blood. I stood up, legs shaking.
I grabbed the chain for door 3 and pulled. I pulled until my vision swam. The door rattled down. Clang. Locked. Door 4. Door 5. Door 6. I worked down the line, a machine of flesh and blood operating machines of steel. Door 7 was the last one, the furthest from the pit. As I reached for the chain, I saw them. A group of 10, maybe 12.
They were moving across the asphalt apron, heading right for the open bay. They were not running, but they were moving with a terrifying, single-minded purpose. I grabbed the chain. I pulled. The mechanism jammed. The chain would not budge. The door hung fully open. I looked up. A piece of debris, a fractured pallet slat, was wedged in the sprocket housing 20 feet up. No, 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 I muttered. I could not fix it from here. I needed a ladder, or... I looked at the forklift parked near the maintenance cage. A Toyota heavy lift model. I ran to it. No key. Standard ignition, I whispered. I pulled my pocket knife, jammed the blade into the ignition slot, and twisted. Nothing. Universal, I corrected myself. I reached under the dash, ripped the wires out. I stripped the red and the yellow with my teeth, spitting the plastic coating onto the floor. I touched them together. A spark, then the starter cranked. Chug, 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 vroom! The propane engine roared to life. I slammed it into gear and floored it. The tires squealed on the smooth concrete. I drove the forklift toward door 7. The group of infected was 20 feet from the threshold. I did not slow down. I aimed the forks at the lead figure, a man in a suit. The steel tines caught him in the chest, pinning him against the oncoming mass. I kept driving, pushing the forklift right to the edge of the door opening. I dropped the mast, blocking the bottom 4 feet of the entrance with the solid steel body of the machine. It was not a seal, but it was a barricade. The infected slammed into the forklift. The machine rocked, but the 5-ton counterweight held it firm. Hands reached over the roll cage. Snapping jaws pushed through the gaps in the mast. I bailed out the back, scrambling away. I grabbed a discarded length of heavy logging chain from a pile of rigging gear. I ran to the forklift. Staying out of reach of the grasping hands, I looped the chain through the forklift's roll cage and around the structural column of the building. I secured it with a load binder, cranking the lever until the chain was tight as a piano wire. The forklift was not going anywhere. I stepped back, chest heaving. The 7 massive doors were closed or blocked. The tipping floor was dim now, lit only by the skylights and the flickering overhead sodiums. I was alone. I walked to the edge of the pit. I looked down into the abyss of garbage. 30 feet down, amidst the tons of plastic and rot, the truck driver who had fallen was moving. He was broken, twisted at impossible angles, but he was dragging himself through the trash, looking up at me. I picked up a piece of heavy debris, a brake drum from a truck, and held it over the railing. Gravity is a law. It is the one thing you can trust. I let it go. I did not wait to see the impact. I turned my back on the pit and looked up at the crane cab, hanging in the gloom like a suspended sanctuary. My watch beeped. 6 a.m. Shift change. Nobody was coming. I walked toward the maintenance cage. I needed tools. I needed to weld door 7 shut. I needed to check the water levels in the boiler. I needed to figure out how to keep a 25-megawatt power plant running with a crew of 1. I checked the pressure gauge on the fire suppression system as I passed it. 150 psi. Good. I wiped the black blood from my cheek. All right,
I said to the empty, echoing room. Let's get to work. The first rule of stationary engineering is that a machine does not care if you are grieving. A steam turbine rotating at 3,600 revolutions per minute has a kinetic energy that is indifferent to the end of the world. It requires lubrication, vibration monitoring, and a precise balance of steam pressure. If you neglect it to mourn the dead, it will disassemble itself with the force of a small bomb and kill you. I dragged Miller's body by the heels of his work boots. He was heavy, a dead weight in the truest sense, his mass settling into the gravity of the floor. The friction of his denim jeans against the anti-static tiles made a soft, dry, rasping sound that seemed deafening in the quiet of the control room. I pulled him out of the pulpit, down the hallway, and into the janitor's closet. I did the same for Sanchez.
It was not a burial, but it was the best I could do. I locked the door and pocketed the key. I returned to the control board. The room was a horseshoe of beige steel panels studded with analog gauges, pistol grip switches, and digital readouts. In the center sat the distributed control system, 3 monitors that displayed the plant's nervous system in schematic form. I sat in Miller's chair. The leather was still warm. I wiped a smear of blood off the trackball mouse with my sleeve and focused on the numbers. Grid frequency, 59, 8 Hertz. Generator output, 24, 2 megawatts. Boiler pressure, 850 psi. The plant was stable, but the grid, the massive web of copper and aluminum connecting Gary to Chicago and beyond, was dying. The frequency was fluctuating wildly, dipping to 59.5, then spiking. That meant load shedding. Power plants were tripping offline, or substations were exploding, or transmission lines were grounding out. The grid was a living organism, and right now, it was having a seizure. If the grid collapsed while I was connected to it, the shock would trip my generator protectives, the turbine would shut down, the boilers would trip on high pressure, the safety valves would lift, venting superheated steam to the atmosphere, and the plant would go dark. A dark plant is a dead plant. Without electricity, I could not run the feed water pumps. Without water, the boilers would boil dry. If they boiled dry while the fire was still hot, the tubes would melt. I had to disconnect. I had to island the facility, sever the tie to the outside world, and power the plant with its own electricity. It was a maneuver that usually required 3 operators, 1 on the board, 1 at the turbine, and 1 at the switchgear. I was alone. I stared at the synchroscope, the dial that showed the phase angle between my generator and the grid. "Okay," I whispered. "Do not screw this up." I reached for the pistol grip switch labeled main breaker. My hand hovered. Once I turned this, I was on my own. No backup power. No help. I twisted the handle to trip. The sound of the breaker opening was a sharp, mechanical slap that resonated through the floor plates, followed instantly by the change in the turbine's pitch. The resistance on the generator vanished. Suddenly unloaded, the turbine engine accelerated, the RPMs shooting up. The needle on the tachometer swung toward the red zone, 3,650 RPM. 3,700. If it hit 3,960, the mechanical overspeed bolt would trip, slamming the stop valves shut and killing the engine. I grabbed the governor control toggle. I hammered it down, pulsing the signal to the steam inlet valves. Close, close, close. I watched the steam flow indicator plummet. I was strangling the turbine, starving it of steam to bring the speed down. The RPMs hovered at 3,800. Still too high. "Down!" I hissed through gritted teeth. "Get down!" I held the toggle. The steam valves groaned, a hydraulic shudder I could feel through the desk. 3,750. 3,610. 3,600. The needle steadied. Now the second problem. I had cut the steam flow to the turbine, but the boiler was still producing it at full capacity. The pressure in the main header spiked. 900 psi. 950 psi. At 1,000 psi, the safety valves on the roof would lift. That would sound like a jet engine taking off and would tell every zombie within 5 miles exactly where dinner was served. I grabbed the mouse and clicked on the steam dump valve controller. I dragged the set point to 50%. Outside, on the roof, the silencers baffled the roar, but I still heard the rush of steam bypassing the turbine and heading straight for the air-cooled condenser. It sounded like a massive, continuous exhalation. I looked at the electrical load. House load, 2.1 megawatt. The plant consumed 2 megawatts of its own power to run the fans, pumps, and conveyors. The generator was now producing exactly that amount. We were stable. We were an island. I slumped back in the chair, sweat cooling on my forehead. The monitor showed green lines. The heart was beating. But a heart needs blood, and a boiler needs water. I stood up. The adrenaline crash was hitting me, making my hands tremble. I needed to inspect the loop.
I grabbed the radio, clipped it to my belt, and walked out of the control room.
I headed for the water treatment plant, located in the annex building on the ground floor. The corridors were empty, lit by the flickering fluorescent tubes. Every shadow looked like a crouching figure. I walked with my maglite in my left hand and the heavy steel bolt cutters in my right. The water treatment room was humid and smelled of ozone and chlorine. This was where we took city water, filtered it, demineralized it, and fed it to the boiler. I checked the makeup water tank, 60% full. I checked the city water inlet pressure gauge, 0 psi. I tapped the glass face of the gauge with my fingernail. The needle did not move. The city water pumps had failed. Gary was dry. Fantastic, I said. The plant was a closed loop. Steam went out, condensed into water, and came back. But it was not a perfect loop. We lost water through steam leaks, soot blowers, and boiler blowdown. Without city water makeup, the tank level would drop. When it hit 10%, the pumps would trip. Then the boiler would starve. I calculated the loss rate in my head. At current load, I was losing maybe 200 gallons an hour. The tank held 10,000 gallons. I had about 50 hours. 2 days. I needed a new water source. There was a fire protection pond out back, a stagnant, algae-filled reservoir. I could pump from there, but the water was dirty.
It would foul the demineralizers in hours. I'd have to deal with that later. For now, 50 hours was a lifetime. I moved to the next critical system, the ash. Boiler Unit 2 was burning trash. That trash turned into ash, bottom ash, the heavy clinkers, and fly ash, the toxic dust caught by the scrubbers. The bottom ash dropped from the grate into a water-filled trough in the basement, where a drag chain conveyor scraped it out to the ash building. I walked to the basement access door. The sign on it read, "Caution, high noise area, hearing protection required." I put in my earplugs, twisting the foam cylinders and jamming them into my canals until the world became muffled. I opened the door. The basement was the bowels of the beast. It was dark, hot, and wet. Water dripped from the ceiling, condensation from the steam pipes. The air tasted of sulfur and wet concrete. The noise was a physical pressure, a rhythmic grinding of steel on steel. I walked along the metal grating walkway. Below me, the ash conveyor moved slowly, the heavy steel bars scraping along the bottom of the water trough. Scrape,
splash, scrape. Then, a different sound. A groan of metal under stress. The conveyor motor whined, changing pitch. The chain stopped. I ran to the drive motor at the end of the line. The fluid coupling was spinning, but the gearbox shaft was stationary. It had stalled. If I did not clear this, the ash would pile up in the chute.
It would back up into the furnace, block the airflow, and choke the fire. I killed the power at the local disconnect switch. The motor spun down into silence. I grabbed a 6-foot pry bar from the wall rack and a 10-pound sledgehammer. I climbed down the ladder to the floor level, standing next to the water trough. The heat radiating from the water was intense, 100-degree soup. I looked into the inspection port. A massive clinker, a fused lump of melted glass, metal, and wire the size of a beach ball, had jammed between the drag bar and the turnstile at the end of the loop. I jammed the tip of the pry bar into the gap. I leaned my entire weight on it, boots slipping on the wet concrete. It did not budge. The fused slag was hard as granite. I repositioned the bar, trying to find a fracture point. The water in the trough was dark gray, swirling with suspended grit. I swung the sledgehammer, striking the end of the pry bar. The shockwave rattled my wrists. I struck it again. A chip of glass flew off, pinging against my safety glasses. "Break, you son of a bitch," I grunted. I swung a third time, putting my back into it. The steel hammerhead connected with the bar, driving the chisel point deep into the clinker. A hairline crack appeared. I dropped the hammer and grabbed the bar with both hands, heaving sideways. With a sensation like a gunshot cracking through rock, the clinker split. The tension released, and the drag chain jumped forward an inch. I fished the broken pieces out with a rake, heaving the steaming, jagged lumps onto the floor. They hissed as they cooled. I climbed back up the ladder and threw the disconnect switch. The motor hummed, the gearbox engaged, and the chain began to move again. Scrape, splash, scrape. The bowels were moving. I ascended from the basement, stripping off my wet gloves. My shirt was soaked with sweat, sticking to my back. I checked my watch. 8:30 a.m. The plant was stable. The water was counting down. The ash was moving. Now, the perimeter. I went to the maintenance shop. It was a cage in the center of the ground floor, filled with the holy relics of industry. Drill presses, band saws, racks of steel stock. I wheeled out the Miller welder, a portable stick welding unit on a handcart. I grabbed a box of 60-10 welding rods. They were farmer's rods, designed to burn through rust, paint, and dirt. Perfect for what I needed to do. I rolled the cart out to the tipping floor. The sun was fully up now, slicing through the skylights in sharp, dusty beams. The forklift was still jammed into door 7. Outside, on the other side of the forklift, I could hear them. A low, persistent scratching. The sound of fingernails on steel. A soft moaning that did not sound human. It sounded like air escaping a lung that did not know how to breathe. I did not look through the gap. I did not want to know faces. I unspooled the ground lead and clamped it to the door track. I plugged the machine into a 480-volt outlet on the column. I dialed the amperage to 125. I pulled my welding hood down. The world turned green-black. I struck the arc. The electric fire crackled, a violent hiss of energy. I focused on the puddle of molten steel, weaving the rod back and forth, bridging the gap between the door track and the heavy steel door frame. The smell of burning flux filled the air, acrid and sharp. I welded the bottom corner. Then I stood on the forklift's tire and welded the slide lock. I moved up, laying beads of steel every 2 feet.
I was sealing the tomb. When I finished door 7, I moved to door 1, then door 2. I welded the chain hoists to the wall brackets. I welded the latches. By noon, the tipping floor was a fortress. The only way in or out was the personnel door I had locked, or the 30-foot drop into the pit. I sat on the bumper of the forklift, eating a packet of stale peanut butter crackers I'd found in the break room vending machine. My hands were black with grease and soot. I looked up at the crane. The fire in the boiler was hungry. The grapple I had dropped hours ago had burned down. The steam pressure would start to sag soon. I had to go back up. I climbed the 4 flights of stairs to the crane level. My legs burned. The fatigue was setting in, a dull ache in the marrow of my bones.
I sat in the operator's chair. I looked down at the pit. The body of the truck driver I had dropped was gone, buried under fresh trash, or had he crawled somewhere deep in the pile? I pushed the joystick. The grapple descended. I spent the next 3 hours feeding the beast. It was a mindless, rhythmic task. Pick, lift, drop. Pick, lift, drop. I watched the fire monitor. The combustion chamber was a churning inferno of orange and yellow. It consumed everything. Plastic, wood, organic matter. It sanitized the filth. It turned corruption into sterile ash. There was something comforting in that. At 4 p.m., I secured the crane and went back to the control room. I needed to set up a sleeping area. I could not sleep here. The chair was too uncomfortable, and the monitors were too bright. I chose the conference room down the hall. It had no windows. One door. I dragged a couch from the reception area into the room. I raided the first aid kits for painkillers, ibuprofen for the swelling in my hands, aspirin for the headache that the welding fumes had given me. I went to the locker room. I broke the lock on Kowalski's locker. I found a spare uniform shirt, a bag of beef jerky, and a bottle of whiskey tucked behind his boots. Cheap bourbon. I took it all. Back in the conference room, I sat on the couch. I poured a shot of bourbon into a paper coffee cup. I looked at the whiteboard on the wall. It still had the production targets for the week written in blue marker. Weekly goal, 4,500 tons. Safety, 412 days without lost time injury. I stood up. I uncapped the marker. I erased the 412. I wrote 0. Then I erased weekly goal. I wrote water, 48 hours. I sat back down and drank the whiskey. It burned, a clean, sharp heat that cut through the taste of ash in my mouth. I closed my eyes, listening to the hum of the plant. It was vibrating around me. The turbine, the fans, the pumps. A symphony of rotating equipment. As long as I heard that hum, I was alive. But under the hum, at the edge of hearing, I could hear other sounds coming from the vents. The scratching, the moaning. Gary was burning outside. I could smell the smoke through the intake dampers. It was not the clean smoke of my stack. It was the dirty, oily smoke of looting and chaos. I checked the monitor I had rigged up in the corner, a feed from the perimeter cameras. The fence line was compromised. They were inside the wire. Dozens of them. They were wandering the asphalt apron, bumping into the welded doors, staring up at the lights. They could not get in. Not yet. But systems fail. Bearings seize. Pipes corrode. Wires fray. I was the only antibody left in this immune system. I lay down on the couch, the radio on the floor next to my head.
I stared at the acoustic tile ceiling. I needed a plan for the water.
I needed to build a pump system to pull from the fire pond. I needed filter media, sand, charcoal. I could make charcoal from the pallets in the warehouse. I could use sand from the winter grit pile. I started designing the filter in my head. A 50-gallon drum, layers of aggregate, a submersible pump powered by an extension cord from the maintenance shed. Engineering. It was the only thing that made sense. The problem, the solution, the execution. I fell asleep designing the filtration system, dreaming of clear, clean water flowing through pipes, while the dead scratched at the steel walls of my fortress. I woke to the sensation of a pressure change in my inner ear. It was a subtle pop, the kind you feel in an elevator descending too quickly. But I was lying flat on a couch in a windowless conference room. I sat up, the stiff fabric of the borrowed uniform scraping against my skin. My neck was a knot of tension. I checked my watch. 10:15 a.m. I had slept for 4 hours. The hum of the plant was different. The pitch had shifted. I grabbed my boots and laced them with fumbling, sleep-numbed fingers. I grabbed the radio. Status, I whispered to myself, a habit from years of working alone. I walked into the hallway. The air felt heavier, charged with static electricity. The hair on my arms stood up. I went straight to the control room. The monitors told the story. The barometric pressure was plummeting. The graph line looked like a cliff edge. Outside, the wind speed sensor on the stack was registering gusts of 40 miles per hour out of the northwest. A Lake Michigan storm. In Gary, the weather does not just happen. It assaults you. The lake is a massive heat engine, and when cold Canadian air hits that relatively warm water, it breeds monsters. I looked at the boiler draft gauges. The fluctuating wind pressure at the top of the stack was messing with the furnace draft. The induced draft fan was hunting, ramping up and down to maintain the negative pressure in the firebox. Whoosh, whine, whoosh, whine. It was annoying, but the PID controllers could handle it. My priority remained the water. The storm would actually help, provided it dumped rain and did not tear the roof off. But I could not rely on catching rainwater in buckets to feed a boiler that drank thousands of gallons a day. I needed the fire pond. I went to the workshop. I needed to build a rough service filtration unit. I found a 55-gallon steel drum in the lube oil storage cage. It was empty, smelling faintly of synthetic gear oil. I rolled it out to the center of the floor. I took a reciprocating saw and cut the top off. The blade bit into the steel, the vibration rattling my teeth, sending a spray of hot metal filings across my gloves. I worked slowly, letting the tool do the work, cutting a clean circle. Next, the bulkhead fitting. I drilled a 2-inch hole near the bottom of the drum. The drill bit smoked, squealing as it chewed through the heavy gauge steel. I cooled it with a squirt of cutting fluid, the smell of burning oil mixing with the ozone. I threaded a PVC adapter into the hole and sealed it with a thick bead of industrial silicone. Now, the media. I raided the landscaping supply shed near the admin block entrance. I found bags of pea gravel and play sand, leftovers from some forgotten beautification project. I dragged the bags back to the shop. My back complained, a sharp pinch near the lumbar, but I ignored it. I layered the filter. 6 inches of large gravel at the bottom to cover the outlet pipe, then 6 inches of pea gravel, then a foot of sand. I needed activated carbon to pull out the organic contaminants, the algae, and whatever else was rotting in that pond. I went to the loading dock where we kept the wooden pallets. I took a sledgehammer and smashed 3 oak pallets into splintered slats. I carried the wood to the tipping floor.
I piled it on the concrete near the edge of the pit and soaked it with a splash of diesel fuel. I lit it. The fire flared up, orange and greedy. I let it burn hot for 10 minutes, then I smothered it with a shovelful of floor sweepings. I did not want ash. I wanted char.
I shoveled the steaming black chunks of charcoal into a metal bucket, crushed them into a coarse powder with the head of the sledgehammer, and poured a layer into the drum. Sand, charcoal, gravel. Simple physics. I loaded the heavy drum onto a hand truck. I coiled a 100-foot extension cord and grabbed a submersible sump pump from the shelf. I headed for the rear personnel door near the cooling tower. This was the dangerous part. The fire pond was inside the perimeter fence, but outside the main building. It was 50 yards of open ground. I cracked the door. The wind ripped it from my hand, slamming it against the exterior wall. The sky was a bruised, sickly green. Rain was falling in horizontal sheets, stinging like birdshot. The roar was deafening, the sound of the lake crashing against the shore miles away, mixed with the howl of wind tearing through the industrial lattice of the plant. I scanned the yard. The rain reduced visibility to gray noise. I could see the chain-link perimeter fence rattling violently. I pushed the hand truck out into the storm. The rain soaked me instantly. Cold, hard water. I leaned into the wind, fighting the hand truck over the cracked asphalt. The wheels rattled and jumped. I reached the edge of the pond. It was a dark, rectangular scar in the earth, the water whipped into whitecaps by the gale. I tipped the drum upright. I connected the hose from the submersible pump to the top of the drum. I ran a second hose from the bottom of the drum to the emergency fill port on the exterior wall of the plant. I dropped the pump into the murky water. It sank with a gurgle. I ran the extension cord back to the door, plugging it into the exterior outlet. I flipped the switch on the pump cord. The hose jerked as pressure built. I watched the outlet hose on the drum. For a moment, nothing. Then, a stream of brown sludge. Then, as the water filtered through the sand and charcoal, it cleared. It was not Evian, but it was clear enough for a boiler. "Good," I shouted over the wind. "That's good." I turned to head back inside. That's when the sound changed. It was not the wind. It was a mechanical scream, a high-pitched, harmonic vibration that shook the ground beneath my boots. It sounded like a jet engine trying to tear itself apart. I looked up. On the roof of the turbine hall, the air-cooled condenser, ACC deck, was invisible from this angle. But I knew that sound. Fan imbalance. I bolted for the door, wrestling it shut against the wind. I locked it and sprinted for the control room. My boots squeaked on the tile, leaving wet footprints. I burst into the room. The alarm panel was a wall of flashing red LEDs. ACC fan 4 vibration high. ACC fan 4 motor overload. Turbine back pressure deviation. I threw myself into the chair. The vibration monitor for fan 4 was pegged at 12 mils. Anything over 10 was catastrophic. The massive 40-foot diameter fan was shaking so hard it threatened to shear the bolts holding the motor mount to the steel frame. If the fan broke loose, the blades would slice through the steam tubes like a blender through fruit. The vacuum would break. The steam would have nowhere to go. The turbine would trip. And in this storm, with the grid down, if the turbine tripped, I would never get it started again. I did not have the battery capacity to run the auxiliary oil pumps long enough to cool the bearings down. The shaft would warp. The plant would be a brick. I grabbed the mouse. I tried to trip fan 4 remotely. I clicked stop. The command turned yellow on the screen. Command fail. Relay failure, I cursed.
The vibration must have rattled the local disconnect, or the control wire was damaged. I had to stop it locally. I grabbed my hard hat and the master keys. I grabbed a heavy padlock from the desk drawer, my personal lockout-tagout lock. I ran to the stairwell. The roof access was 7 flights up. My wet clothes weighed 50 pounds. My breath tore at my throat as I climbed, taking the steps 2 at a time. Level 3. Level 4. The vibration got worse the higher I went. By level 6, the handrails were buzzing in my grip. The concrete walls were humming. Level 7. The roof. I pushed the crash bar on the door. It swung open, and the storm punched me in the chest.
The roof of the plant was a flat expanse of gravel and tar, dominated by the massive A-frame structure of the air-cooled condenser. It looked like a giant radiator the size of a football field, raised up on steel legs. Underneath the A-frame were the fans, 6 of them, massive horizontal propellers driving air up through the finned tubes. Fan 4 was in the middle. I could see it from here. It was wobbling violently, the entire steel support structure swaying. I ducked my head and ran into the wind. The rain was blinding. I reached the catwalk that ran underneath the fans. The noise was apocalyptic. The wind howled through the steel grating, mixing with the rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum of the 5 healthy fans and the violent clatter, bang of fan 4. I saw the problem. A sheet of corrugated metal siding, probably torn from a nearby warehouse by the wind, had been sucked into the fan intake. It was wedged between 2 of the fiberglass blades, throwing the balance off by hundreds of pounds. I had to kill the power. The local disconnect switch was mounted on the support column, 10 feet from the spinning blades of death. I clipped my safety harness lanyard to the handrail. The wind tried to throw me over the side, but the tether held. I shuffled along the wet grating. I reached the switch box. It was shaking so hard I could barely focus on the handle. I grabbed the heavy red lever. I yanked it down. Ka-chunk! The breaker opened. The motor cut out. The fan did not stop immediately. Momentum kept the massive blade spinning, but the driving force was gone. The violence of the shaking began to subside as the RPMs dropped. I pulled my padlock from my pocket. I slapped it onto the hasp of the switch handle and clicked it shut. I tugged on it. Locked. Now I had to clear the debris. I waited for the fan to coast to a stop. It took an agonizing 2 minutes. Finally, the blades drifted to a halt. The sheet of metal was jammed tight, bent in a V shape around the leading edge of one blade. I climbed over the handrail, stepping onto the fan support beam. This was technically a violation of every safety protocol in the book, but the OSHA inspector was probably eating brains somewhere in Indianapolis. I balanced on the beam, the abyss of the fan shroud below me. If I slipped, I'd fall 20 feet onto the gravel roof below the condenser deck. I grabbed the metal sheet with both gloved hands. I pulled. It did not move. The wind pressure had wedged it in deep. I braced my boot against the fan hub. I heaved, grunting with effort. The metal groaned, screeching against the fiberglass blade. It shifted an inch. "Come on," I growled. The wind gusted, hitting me like a physical blow. I slipped. My left boot skidded off the wet steel beam. I fell. My lanyard snapped taut, arresting my fall with a brutal jerk that squeezed the air out of my lungs. I swung there, dangling below the fan deck, swaying in the gale. I gasped, trying to find purchase. My feet kicked at empty air. I looked down. Below me, on the gravel roof of the main building, a skylight had shattered. The glass was gone. And climbing out of the skylight,
Emerging from the warm interior of the turbine hall onto the storm-lashed roof was a figure. It was a man in a tattered boiler suit. He was burned, skin blackened and peeling. He must have stumbled into a steam leak downstairs before he turned. He looked up. He saw me dangling like a lure on a fishing line. He did not moan. He snarled, a wet, aggressive sound that cut through the wind. He reached for the ladder that led up to the fan deck. He was fast, much faster than the shamblers in the yard. The fresh ones, Kowalski had called them. No, this was just pure predatory instinct. I hauled myself up the lanyard, hand over hand. My muscles screamed. I got a knee onto the beam, then a boot. I rolled back onto the catwalk just as the burned man crested the ladder. He did not pause. He sprinted along the grating, his boots hammering on the metal mesh. I was unarmed. My bolt cutters were in the control room. My knife was in my pocket, useless against a charging maniac. I looked at the fan. The metal sheet was still wedged in the blade. The wind. I grabbed the disconnect switch. I unlocked my padlock with shaking fingers. The burned man was 10 feet away. 5.
I ripped the lock off. I slammed the lever up. On. The motor did not hesitate. It was a 200 horsepower industrial drive. It applied torque instantly. The fan blades lurched into motion. The sheet of corrugated metal, still wedged in the blades, acted like a massive scythe. The burned man lunged at me. I dropped to the grating, flattening myself. The fan blade swung around. The jagged edge of the metal siding caught the man in the midsection. There was no sound of cutting meat, only a dull, heavy impact, like a baseball bat hitting a wet mattress. The kinetic energy was immense. The man was lifted off his feet and thrown sideways, launched off the catwalk and into the open air beyond the handrail. I watched him tumble, a rag doll in the storm, until he disappeared over the edge of the roof, falling 6 stories to the concrete apron below. The fan was shaking again, violently. The metal sheet was still stuck. I reached up and slammed the disconnect handle down. Off. I lay on the grating, rain washing the sweat from my face. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had to finish the job. I waited for the fan to stop again. I climbed back out onto the beam. I kicked the metal sheet until it deformed, bending it enough to free it from the blade. I shoved it down through the shroud, watching it flutter to the roof below. I spun the fan blade by hand. It moved freely. No cracks in the fiberglass. I climbed back to safety. I locked the switch out again, just to be safe while I checked the mounts, then unlocked it and re-energized the system. The fan spun up. Smooth. The vibration was gone. I did not celebrate. I just clipped my lanyard to my belt and walked back to the roof access door. The descent was a blur. My legs were rubber. I collapsed into the chair in the control room. I looked at the board. ACC fan 4, vibration, 0.5 mils. Turbine back pressure, 2.5 in Hartgrame A, normal. The red lights cleared. The board went green. I looked at the water tank level. Makeup flow, 15 GPM. Tank level, 62%. It was rising. I leaned forward, burying my face in my hands. The smell of ozone and wet wool filled my nose. I had water. I had power. I had a fortress. But I had a breach. The skylight. The burned man had come from inside. I grabbed the radio. I grabbed the bolt cutters. I could not rest. Not yet. I had to find the broken skylight from the inside. I had to find out how he got in. And I had to find out if he was alone.
I walked out to the turbine deck. I looked up at the high ceiling. There, above the generator, a panel of wire glass was missing. Rain was falling through the hole, sizzling as it hit the hot casing of the steam turbine. The burned man had not climbed out. He had climbed in. From the roof. Or maybe he had been up there on maintenance when the world ended, and the storm drove him to find a way down.
I scanned the shadows of the turbine hall. The massive yellow machine blocked my view of the far corners. I drew my flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom. "Is anyone there?" I shouted. The only answer was the steady, indifferent whine of the turbine. I walked the perimeter of the hall. I checked every shadow. I checked the lube oil reservoir room. I checked the switchgear room. Empty. But the fear did not leave. The plant felt different now. It was not just a machine I was operating. It was a shell. And the shell had a crack. I went back to the workshop. I cut a piece of plywood. I carried it up to the roof, taking the internal stairs this time, weapon in hand, and patched the skylight from the outside, weighing it down with cinder blocks. It was a temporary fix. Back in the control room, I watched the monitors. The storm raged on outside. The wind battered the walls. I looked at the eraser board where I had written my goals. Water. Secured. I picked up the marker. I wrote a new line below it. Perimeter. Failing. I sat there for a long time, watching the rain streak the camera lenses, blurring the world into a gray smear. I was not just an operator anymore. I was a prisoner. And the walls were getting thinner. I opened the desk drawer and took out the bottle of whiskey. I did not drink. I just held the cold glass against my forehead. The competence that had saved me, the knowledge of amps and volts and hydraulics, felt fragile. You can fix a machine. You can replace a bearing. You can weld a door. But you cannot fix the fact that there is only one of you. I looked at the door to the hallway. I had locked it. I had wedged a chair under the handle. It was not enough. I needed to fortify the interior. I needed traps. I needed alarms. I needed to turn the plant into a weapon. Time in the plant ceased to be measured in hours or days. It became a measure of vibration and pressure. The Gregorian calendar is useless when you live inside a machine. Instead, I lived in the epoch of the turbine. Morning was when I blew down the water columns to clear the sludge. Noon was the preventative maintenance round on the hydraulic pumps. Night was the long, static vigil in the control room, watching the green lines on the monitors trace the heartbeat of the last living thing in Indiana. November arrived not with snow, but with a hardening of the world. The temperature inside the plant dropped. The massive boilers radiated heat, keeping the process areas warm, but the outlying corridors, the admin block, the switchgear rooms, became meat lockers. The uninsulated metal walls conducted the Midwestern frost with efficient cruelty. My routine had calcified into a ritual. 0600. Wake up in the conference room. Eat a ration of canned peaches or dry granola. 0630. The walk. I walked the plant counterclockwise. I checked the bearing oil temperature on the feed pumps. I listened to the pitch of the pulverizers. I touched the casing of the transformers to feel for the hum of internal arcing. I had become the facility's proprioceptive nervous system. I knew that boiler feed pump A had a slight cavitation rattle when the load dropped below 10 megawatts. I knew that the number 3 conveyor squealed because the idler bearing was dry, but I could not spare the grease to fix it. I saved the grease for the turbine. The solitude was absolute. It was a physical weight, like wearing a lead vest.
I found myself talking to the equipment not out of madness, but out of professional courtesy. "Steady, girl," I would whisper to the turbine as the vibration monitor ticked up a fraction of a mil during a load shift. "Do not get shaky on me." The plant was running, but it was starving. Not for fuel. The pit was still half full, a mountain of trash that would last another 4 months at reduced load. But for chemistry. We burned garbage. Garbage contains PVC, batteries, and painted wood. When you burn that, you get acid gas, hydrochloric and sulfuric. To stop the acid from eating the steel stack and turning the exhaust into a war crime, we injected a lime slurry into the scrubbers. The lime tank was at 15%. When the lime ran out, the sensors would trip. If I bypassed the sensors, the acid would condense in the flue gas ductwork. It would eat through the quarter-inch carbon steel plate in a week.
Then the exhaust, 400 degrees and toxic, would vent into the building. I would suffocate in my own fortress. I needed to refill the day tank from the main silo outside. The silo stood on the north side of the lot, isolated from the main building by 40 yards of asphalt. It was a tall, white cylinder that looked like a farm silo on steroids. I spent 3 days planning the operation. First, I reinforced my perimeter defenses. The welding on the doors held, but welding is static. I needed something dynamic. I went to the steam distribution header in the basement. I found a 2-inch line that supplied the auxiliary heating coils for the admin block. I cut it. I ran a new Schedule 80 steel pipe from the header to the vestibule of the main personnel entrance, the most likely breach point if the glass broke. I drilled a hole through the interior wall and positioned the open end of the pipe aiming at the door at chest height. I installed a quick opening ball valve in the hallway, rigged with a tripwire made of high-test fishing line. If someone, or something, opened that door without disarming the trap, the wire would pull the valve handle. A jet of 300-degree steam at 150 psi would erupt into the vestibule. It would not just burn. It would strip meat from bone. It was a claymore mine made of water vapor. I tested the valve action dry. Smooth. Now, the lime. I watched the monitors for 2 days, tracking the movement of the infected. The cold had slowed them down. They huddled against the south wall of the building, seeking the radiant heat from the boilers. They were sluggish, their movements stiff, like machines with thickened oil. But the north side, the silo side, was exposed to the wind. It was clear. I chose a Tuesday morning. The sky was a flat, slate gray. The wind was gusting, which would mask the sound of my movement. I suited up. I wore fire-retardant coveralls, a heavy Carhartt jacket, my hard hat, and safety glasses. I taped my cuffs and ankles with duct tape. Bite protection. I carried a pipe wrench, a 24-inch rigid steel pipe wrench that weighed enough to crush a skull, and a pry bar. I exited through the maintenance shop door. I locked it behind me. The cold hit me like a slap. The air smelled of ozone and impending snow. I scanned the yard. Clear. I sprinted toward the silo. My boots crunched on the frost-heaved pavement. I felt heavy, slow, encumbered by the layers of clothing. I reached the silo base. The control panel was housed in a weatherproof box. I popped the latch. The panel was dead. No lights. Right, I hissed. Island mode. The silo was fed from a separate electrical bus that I had cut when I isolated the plant. I had not thought about that. The screw conveyor that moved the lime from the silo to the plant would not run without power. I looked up at the silo. It was full. 60 tons of pebble lime. But I could not move it mechanically. I had to do it manually. There was a gravity chute on the side, used for sampling. If I opened it, lime would pour out.
I could fill buckets. Buckets. To fill a 2,000-gallon tank? It would take hundreds of trips. Impossible. I looked at the terrain. The ground sloped slightly from the silo toward the plant's loading dock. I ran back to the maintenance shed, moving low. I grabbed a wheelbarrow and 2 plastic 50-gallon drums. I returned to the silo. The wind was picking up, whistling through the support legs of the structure. I positioned the first drum under the gravity chute. I pulled the lever. The slide gate was frozen. Corrosion and ice. I hammered the handle with the pipe wrench. The vibration rang out, a dull metallic note that was swallowed by the wind. I hit it again. The gate jerked open. White powder poured out, a dusty avalanche. It filled the drum in seconds, spilling over onto the asphalt. The dust kicked up, choking me. Lime is caustic. If you breathe it, it turns to calcium hydroxide in your lungs. It burns. I slammed the gate shut. I coughed, pulling my neck gaiter up over my nose. I capped the drum. I tilted it, straining against the 300 pounds of weight, and walked it onto the wheelbarrow. I started the push back to the plant. The wheelbarrow tire was low on air.
It wobbled, fighting me every inch of the way. I kept my head on a swivel. Halfway to the door, I saw him. A solitary figure rounded the corner of the ash building. He was frozen, literally. Frost covered his eyebrows and the tatters of his coat. One of his arms was missing below the elbow, the wound cauterized by the cold. He saw me. He did not run. He could not. He shuffled, his stiff joints popping. I did not stop. I could not drop the load. If I tipped the lime, I'd lose a week of acid neutralization. "Stay back," I growled, knowing it was useless. He was in my path. I adjusted my angle, aiming to bypass him on the left. He lunged. It was a clumsy, slow-motion fall. I dropped the handles of the wheelbarrow. The drum stayed upright, thank God. I swung the pipe wrench. I did not aim for the head. The skull is hard, and a round object can deflect a blow. I aimed for the knee. The heavy steel jaw of the wrench connected with his patella. There was no wet crunch this time. It sounded like snapping a dry branch. His leg buckled backward. He collapsed face first onto the pavement. He tried to crawl, his jaw snapping at the air, his remaining hand clawing at the asphalt. I stepped over him. I grabbed the wheelbarrow handles. I lifted and ran. I made it to the maintenance door. I unlocked it, shoved the drum inside, and locked it again. I leaned against the steel door, sliding down to the floor. My lungs burned from the cold air and the lime dust. 1 drum. I needed 10 more to feel safe. I spent the rest of the day making runs. I did not see the crawler again. The cold had claimed him, or he had dragged himself into a hole to wait for spring. By evening, I had 6 drums of lime in the treatment room. I set up a manual bucket brigade, scooping the white powder into the mix tank. It was back-breaking, repetitive labor. My shoulders screamed. My skin itched from the alkaline dust. But the pH meter on the scrubber drain settled at 7.0. Neutral. I had bought another month. December came, and with it, the snow. It fell for 3 days straight, burying the rust belt under 2 feet of white silence. The plant became an island in a literal sense, a dark, steaming fortress rising from a white ocean. The silence changed. The snow dampened the acoustics. The world outside became muffled, soft. I stopped patrolling the perimeter as often. The snow was a better barrier than any fence. The infected could not move through deep drifts. They froze in place, becoming statues in the landscape. I spent my time in the workshop. I started building things I did not need, just to keep my hands moving.
I built a wind turbine out of a scrapped fan motor and PVC pipe. I mounted it on the roof to charge a bank of 12-volt car batteries I'd scavenged. Not because I needed the power, the main turbine was still spinning, but because I wanted redundancy.
I built a distiller to make moonshine from the sugar packets in the break room. It tasted like rubbing alcohol and despair, but it helped me sleep. I began to read the technical manuals, not just referencing them, but reading them cover to cover. Babcock and Wilcox steam, its generation and use. The General Electric Turbine Generator Maintenance Guide. I memorized the tolerance charts. I recited the thermal expansion coefficients of alloy steel like poetry. Ferritic stainless steel expands at 6.5 times 10 to the -6 per degree Fahrenheit. It was a mantra, a prayer to the god of engineering. Christmas came. I knew the date because the control system computer had a calendar widget in the corner of the screen. I celebrated by opening a can of chili and heating it on the steam manifold of the turbine. I sat on the floor of the turbine deck, feeling the vibration of the machine. "Merry Christmas, Unit 2, I said. The turbine whined in response, a steady, reliable F-sharp. That night, I saw the light. I was on the roof, clearing snow from the air intake louvers. The sky was clear, the stars brilliant and cold. I looked to the west, toward Chicago. Usually the horizon was a black void, but there, low on the horizon, was a flicker. It was not a fire. It was too steady, too blue. It was an arc light. A welder? A searchlight? I pulled my binoculars from my jacket. I steadied them on the frozen handrail. There it was. A rhythmic flashing. Flash, flash. Pause. Flash. Morse code? Or just a loose wire shorting out in the wind? I watched it for an hour. It repeated the pattern. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. Someone was alive. Someone had power. Someone was calling out. I lowered the binoculars. The signal was miles away, across the frozen wasteland of Gary, through the industrial ruins, past the interstate clogged with frozen dead. I looked at my plant. The steam plume rising from the stack was thick and white, illuminated by the moonlight. If I left, the plant would die. The boiler needed water. The chemistry needed balancing. The bearings needed oil. If I walked away, within 24 hours, the turbine would trip. The pipes would freeze. The water in the boiler tubes would turn to ice, expanding and rupturing the steel. The heart would stop. And if I did not make it to the light, if it was a trap, if I froze to death in a drift, then the plant dies, and I die, and the light goes out forever. I went back inside. I walked to the control room. I sat at the desk. I keyed the microphone for the plant-wide PA system. I had not used it since the beginning. "This is Vance," I said. My voice sounded foreign, rusty from disuse. The speakers echoed through the empty turbine hall, the tipping floor, the basement. "I see you," I said to the distant light, though they could not hear me. "But I cannot come." I opened the logbook, the official operator's log. I picked up the pen. Date, December 25th. Time, 2200 hours. Status, Unit 2 online. Load 2, 1 megawatt. All parameters nominal. Notes. Observed external signal to the west. Did not respond. The facility requires my presence. I closed the book. I was not a survivor anymore. I was a component.
I was the biological control loop that kept the machine running. The machine kept me warm. It gave me water. It gave me purpose. I realized then that I would never leave. The stasis was not a pause. It was the end state. I would keep the fire burning until the fuel ran out. I would keep the turbine spinning until the bearings failed. And when the machine finally died, when the silence reclaimed the turbine hall, I would sit in this chair in the dark and wait for the cold to take me. But not yet. The trash in the pit was deep. The hydraulics were strong. The steam was hot. I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the turbine hall. The yellow generator spun on its axis, a perfect, balanced rotation. It was beautiful. I went back to the board. I adjusted the boiler trim, tweaking the oxygen mix by 0.5 percentage point to improve efficiency. "Maximum burn," I whispered. Outside, the snow fell on the ruins of the world. Inside, the lights stayed on.